Hey everybody, how's it going? So this beautiful looking book, hardcover edition of my fantasy adventure. Now if you go and buy a copy of this on Amazon Books, it's not going to look as fancy as this one with the brass things. I added those. If you want one of these, it's going to cost you a little bit more. You have to order it through me, not available on Amazon. I always start these videos with the intention of wanting to go through this book chapter by chapter, kind of like in a Cliff Notes style. Oh, this chapter, this happens. Moving on, this chapter, this happens. But I can't do that because to me, I started writing this story in like the 90s, the mid to late 90s. And it has gone through 5 different drafts in that time. So what happens in chapter 1 to me is not what happens in chapter 1 in the book. And what happens in chapter 1 in the book happens like near the end of the story for me. So it's hard to put it all into perspective. I'm really interested in your guys' perspective on this book. I want to hear what you guys had to say about it, because I could talk all day long what this book is about to me. But one of the things is I intentionally wrote it to be open to interpretation. Interpretation. I intentionally wrote it to be open to interpretation. So I want to know what chapter 1 is about to you, what chapter 2 is about to you. If you're new here and you just catching this book is a bunch of short stories, all rammed together, told out of order. So it's up to you guys to figure out what's going on. I could tell you what's going on to me, but again, open to interpretation. Having said all that, I do want to share with you the underlying story to all of this. If you don't know, plot and story are not the same thing. They're 2 completely different things. The plot is what is happening. The story is why it's happening. So one of the underlying stories in this very layered book is about my attempts to write a book. We explore the creative process in here through the metaphor of gardening, and we explore the drafting process through the metaphor of writing or creating libraries. And we explore the production process through the metaphor of creating planets. And that's one of the underlying stories, is my quest to write a book. The main character, Azra, his goal is to take off the veil that the government has placed over his people, the shroud of secrecy for what they're capable of. And in spoiler alert, what his people are capable of are creating planets. That's all metaphor for us. What we're capable of creating are worlds, and the worlds we create are through books. So again, I started writing this in the mid to late 90s in high school. It's gone through so many drafts that I can't possibly tell you what this one is about. Because when I read it, I get flooded with all of the other stories. When I'm going through, I'm sorry, when I'm going through any particular chapter, I'm not going to choose one. And when I'm going through any particular chapter, I get to a paragraph that is a remnant of a previous draft. And my brain just goes, whoa, yeah, we could expand on this and that. And it's like, no, I've chosen not to expand on that in favor of this. That paragraph exists in here solely for this. Yes, I actually say achoo when I sneeze. So that's just one of the stories in underlying this very layered book that I call a book of creation. Another one of the stories is just of making friends in the most unlikely of places with the most unlikely of, it's between a bird and a cat. I was always a fan of Looney Tunes and the Sylvester and Tweety series. Those guys going after each other, but I thought to myself, what if they were actually friends? So, the first chapter is of Azra making friends. Azra's a giant bird, making friends with this little cub of a large cat will eventually grow into a large cat. Let's see here. Yeah, those are the. Then we got a story of an odd couple. We've got an older man and a woman, not a young woman. She's in her 30s. So there's interesting story dynamic going on between them. It's kind of like a father-daughter dynamic kind of thing going on. The old man's telling the woman stories, and there's lessons to be learned here and there. And then we've got the story of the superiors. They start off just as normal people, again thrown into an extraordinary situation, and among them there's corruption that happens. Some aren't corrupted, some are, and so their story goes along seeing how one handles things from a non-corrupted point and how one handles things from a corrupted standpoint of life. In that story, in the branch where one is living in the uncorrupted ways, he's figuring out slowly but surely how to create planets on their own without really any help. and it's a real organic unfolding of things, an organic blooming of things. And the corrupted one, we follow their storyline about how they're really just riding the coattails or riding on the backs of giants, on the people before them. They're not really doing anything themselves. They're just taking from things and making that way. And we come to see how creating that way is really like creating like a house of cards. And in the culmination of that story, we see how the organic structure really withstands the test of time, and the house of cards just crumbles with with just one thing with just one change, the whole thing just comes crumbling down. And then we've got a real political story, like family politics. Not just family politics, but like you get a bunch of powerful people, not power hungry, a bunch of powerful people in one room, and they all have their powers that keep them in balance with each other. But on one end, you have one extreme that really holds a lot of power, and on the other end, you have another extreme that really holds a lot of power. We see how one can be a creative force for good, and one can be a destructive force for evil. Yes, I do tackle the dichotomy of good and evil in this story. I anthropomorphize things. Some of you might call him Magic Man in the Sky, but no, because I split the Magic Man up into like, what is it, 6 different things. They all have their powers of balance, so it's not just one Magic Man in the sky. It's a pantheon of magic people in the sky. There we go. It's a pantheon. Jeez, I even write. They're called the Pantheon. My Swiss cheese brain. My Swiss cheese brain. Okay, seriously, when I try to talk about this book, I can't help but flood into previous drafts. So I think I'm actually talking about stuff that's not actually in this book. I'm interested in what you guys have to say about this book. I really am. So I hope to see some purchases. I hope to see some reviews. I hope to see some dissertations and some theses and some, final doctorates on what this book is at some point in time. That'd be cool. All right, guys. Thanks for watching. We'll see you around.